Welcome to this video over the material in Chapter 19 on remedies. And in this chapter we're going to be talking about the different remedies that courts give to a non-breaching party where a contract has been breached. Before we do that though, let's start with our lawyer joke. And this one goes like this. There was a doctor and a lawyer, and they met each other vacationing in the south of France. And the doctor ran into his lawyer friend and said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And the lawyer said, "Well, you remember that investment property that I bought, that rental? Well, it burned down, and I'm here traveling on the fire insurance proceeds." And the doctor said, "Oh, yeah, that's interesting, because remember that lousy real estate I bought in Louisiana? Well, it flooded, and so I'm here traveling on the flood insurance proceeds." And the lawyer thought about this for a second and then asked the doctor, "Gee, how did you start the flood?" Well, funny or not, I guess we will continue on in our discussion here of contracts and contract remedies. Like I mentioned, the context here is when a contract is breached and one party ends up in court, they're asking the court to fix the problem that was created by the breach or give him or her a remedy. And so we're going to look at the different remedies that courts will give, but there's no real cookie-cutter remedy that is available for every breach of contract. It's really going to depend on the subject matter of the contract and the context as to what type of remedy a court will give. And as we can see here, courts seek to protect the interests of the parties to a contract, and there are different interests involved in different kinds of contracts. And we're going to look at four. First, courts will seek to reimburse an expectation interest. Expectation interest is what the party didn't get as a result of the breach. Then there's reliance interest. Reliance is the amount of money or effort spent in reliance of the other party's performance that never came. There's also a restitution interest. Restitution is basically giving back or paying back what has already been conveyed under, for instance, a voidable contract. And then there's the equitable interest. Sometimes money damages, we'll find out, just aren't adequate to compensate or to remedy one party for the breach by the other. And so there are different equitable remedies that the court will give in those contexts. Let's start by talking about the expectation interest. And again, the expectation interest leads to remedies designed to put the injured party or the non-breaching party in the position that they would have been in had both parties performed. In other words, to give them the benefit of their contract. We're going to look at different types of damages here in expectation interest. And the damages that are most common are for compensatory damages, consequential damages, incidental damages, and then there are a couple of special rules from the UCC, Article 2 in the sale of goods. So let's start with the most common and really the most simple type of damages that are sought. We'll start with compensatory damages. Compensatory damages are, or sometimes called, direct damages. These are damages that directly flow from a breach of the contract. If you want to think about it this way, it's what the party should have gotten under the contract but didn't because of the other side's breach. I like to say this, and if you take notes while you watch these videos, you might write down for compensatory damages that they are the difference between what a party contracted to get and what he or she actually got. Or, conversely, what a party contracted to pay the other side, but because of a breach, ended up having to pay someone else to perform instead. The amount of the difference is compensatory damages. And that amount has to be reasonably certain. The injured party has to be able to prove the amount of damages to a reasonable certainty. Courts don't like to speculate on how much could have been made through the performance of a contract or could be paid. Let me give you a quick example of straight compensatory damages. Let's take the example of a hypothetical rock and roll band. And let's say that the rock and roll band was very popular back in the 1980s, and they're sort of rediscovering their popularity with a new generation, and so they sign a contract to go out and perform over the summer at different concerts. But the members of the band don't really get along all that well, and so the lead singer of the band, the night before the band is going to leave to go out on this tour, he quits and says, nope, I'm not going to do it anymore. I can't stand you guys, and I'm out of here. And so now the other 3 members of the band are kind of panicking, and they realize we have to find some way to replace our lead singer. And so at the last minute, they call around and they find sort of a relatively successful solo artist, we'll call him Sammy. And they call up and they say, hey, Sammy, you want to go out on our summer tour and sing with us on all these tours? We'll pay you $1 million for the summer. And Sammy says, yeah, sure, that'd be great. And so Sammy signs the contract with the band. The band's going to pay him $1 million, and he's going to go perform in all these concerts over the summer. So it's the morning when the tour bus gets ready to leave, and lo and behold, the original lead singer of the band, we'll call him Dave, comes back and says, hey guys, just kidding, I guess I'm ready to go and I'll sing on the summer tour with you guys. And the other 3 members of the band look at each other and say, okay, great, let's go. And they leave Sammy there. And they don't let him to perform under the contract by singing. In fact, let's say that Sammy even showed up and tendered his performance. He was ready, willing, and able to perform, and they just left him there. And so they go out on the summer tour and they perform, and they don't allow Sammy to perform. And at the end of the summer, they also don't pay him under the contract. So Sammy says to himself, I had a contract with these guys, I should go sue them. And so he does. He sues them for breach. They get into court, and the questions come up. Did the band breach the contract? Absolutely. They didn't do what they promised, which was to pay him the $1 million, and they didn't allow him to perform, which is operating in bad faith. And so Sammy asks for compensatory damages. The question is, what are Sammy's compensatory damages? Well, they're the difference between what he contracted to get, $1 million, and what he actually received, which was 0. So his compensatory damages, or direct damages, would be $1 million, right? A very simple calculation. Now, at this point, I want to also introduce another doctrine that's related to damages that comes up in these kinds of cases, and it's especially related to compensatory damages. And that's the idea of what we call mitigation. We'll talk about this later in the chapter, and I'll explain the doctrine of mitigation a little bit more. But basically, mitigation of damages is the idea that the non-breaching party, in this case Sammy, has a legal duty to attempt to lessen his or her damages if he can. So in our context here, let's say that the band leaves, they leave Sammy at home, and they're gone for 3 months over the summer. Well, does that mean that Sammy can just sit back on his couch for 3 months and wait, and then when the time for performance under the contract is up and didn't get paid, then go sue the band and get his full compensatory damages? And the answer is probably not. He has a duty to attempt, and we'll talk about this later, but he doesn't have to be successful, but he has to attempt to lessen his damages if he can. Well, how would he do that? Well, he might be able to mitigate his damages by going out and finding similar performance from another source. Similar performance would be singing or performing, right? Performing musical concerts. So Sammy might be able to go out and on his own as a solo artist book a few concerts to try to make up for the money that the band is not paying him during that time. So let's say he does that. Let's say Sammy is able to go out and he's able to book a few concerts, and over the summer he's able to make $100,000 himself by finding performance from another source, right? Those other sources being these solo concerts. Then at the end of the summer, the band pays him nothing under the contract. He goes into court. He asks for compensatory damages. Now, what are his compensatory damages? The difference between what he contracted to get, which is $1 million, and the difference between what he actually received either from the band or through performance from a different source, mitigation. In this case, it's $100,000. So if Sammy was able to mitigate his damages by $100,000, then the court would give him compensatory damages of $900,000, the difference between the two. Okay, we'll talk about that and do some more examples later on in the chapter, but I just didn't want to leave that out because it is an important part of compensatory damages. Okay, let's talk about a different type of damages, consequential or special damages. You'll read the Hadley versus Baxendale case on this. This goes back to English common law. It's the case that establishes the rule on consequential damages. Okay, what are these and how are they different from compensatory damages? Consequential damages are caused by special circumstances surrounding this particular contract that make the breach of it more harmful than the breach of any other contract without special circumstances. And in this case, the non-breaching party can recover consequential or special damages if the non-breaching party is able to show, and we have the test here on the slide, if the breaching party could have reasonably foreseen these damages at the time the contract was made. Okay, let me give you an example of how this might work. Let's say that you're a building contractor and I'm having you build an apartment building for me. And I stress to you at the time we enter into the contract, this building has to be completed by June 1st. Time is of the essence. It's conditional. The whole thing is conditioned on you being done June 1st. You have to be finished, and you agree, and you sign the contract with the deadline June 1st. And I even tell you, maybe we even put in the contract that it has to be done by June 1st, construction does, because I already have leases, I have prospective tenants lined up, and they're moving in June 1st. And so in order for me to be able to perform on those leases by allowing them to move in, you have to be finished with your construction by then. So this is all known ahead of time. You know that I have these leases lined up, but you agree, yes, June 1st will be fine. Well, then it comes down to June 1st, and you're not finished. And you've breached the contract because we've made it very clear, time is of the essence, June 1st means June 1st, and you're not finished. And so it's the middle or end of June by the time that you finish up with your construction, and now I've missed out on a month's worth of rent. And let's say, I have quite a few leases and tenants lined up. If I sue you for breach of contract and I'm able to prove material breach of contract, one of the types of damages I might ask for are consequential damages. Why? Because there are special circumstances surrounding our contract, the fact that I already had leases in place, that make your breach cause me more damages than just an ordinary breach by not finishing by June 1st, for instance. And so if those damages, my lost profits, as it were foreseeable by you at the time you entered into the contract, knowing that risk, you still entered into the contract, then the court might award my consequential damages. They might make you pay for my lost rent for that 1 month. And this is where we see consequential damages a lot, are with lost profits. That's a pretty common claim. Let's look at incidental damages. Incidental damages is another sort of category of damages, but really incidentals are related to what I've talked about briefly earlier, which is this mitigation idea. You can see incidental damages are expenses incurred to obtain performance from another source. So if we go back to our example of Sammy and the band, let's say, again, Sammy is sitting at home and he's got to try to mitigate his damages. How might he do that? Well, he may have to go out and find some concerts where he can perform to try to make some money. Let's say that Sammy does that, but in order to book some concerts over the summer on his own, he has to hire an agent. And he has to pay the agent, let's say, $10,000. Well, paying the agent $10,000 in order to line up this performance from another source, in order to mitigate, is considered an incidental damage. Incidental damage are expenses related to mitigation. So if Sammy had to pay the agent $10,000, then when Sammy sues the band, then he can add in a claim for that extra $10,000 to be reimbursed for that as an incidental expense. Okay, let's take a look at the UCC and how it treats damages. And we're going to look here, there's going to be a different rule for sellers and buyers in terms of their breach and remedies. So let's take a look first at the seller's remedies for the buyer's breach. Okay, I always like to do this too. Before I get into any questions under the UCC and we start talking about sellers and buyers, I like to think, okay, what's going on? If the buyer is breaching a contract, what does that mean? Well, that means the buyer doesn't pay. That's generally the buyer's performance, right, under the contract for a sale of goods, is to pay. So if the buyer doesn't pay, what does that mean for the seller? Well, here are the rules. Compensatory damages only. No consequential damages. So the seller of goods under a contract, if the buyer doesn't pay, can get compensatory damages, but can't generally get consequential damages, lost profits. Okay, so let's go through and look at what options the seller has if the buyer breaches. First, the seller may try to recover the difference between the contract price and the price actually received, right? So we've got the difference between the contract price and the price the seller actually receives for the sale. So let's say that I'm going to sell you some iPods, and I'm going to sell you, 500 iPods at $100 a piece, and you're the buyer and you breach. Well, what will I do? I still have those iPods, and so I go and I find another buyer. But now I'm not able to sell them for $100 a piece. I'm only able to sell them for $75 a piece. So I could sue you, and my compensatory damages would be the difference, or $25 per iPod. Or maybe I can't find another buyer. I also, under the UCC, or maybe I just don't want to sell them. I want to keep the iPods for whatever reason. And by the time I go to court, I could also choose to sue you for the difference between the contract price, $100 per iPod, and the market price of the goods. So let's say there's a difference between the contract price and the market price. If I can establish, like at what would be an average market price, either wholesale or retail, then I can get the difference between what you are supposed to pay me and the market value. So I would have the option there as the seller. Also, as the seller, based on your breach, I could recover incidental damages that I incur. So if I have to store the iPods somewhere because of your breach, maybe I had delivered them to you and you refused delivery for whatever reason, maybe because you didn't have the money to pay. Well, I have to do something with those iPods now. So let's say I have to pay for storage before I can resell them. That would be the type of incidental damages that I would also be able to recover from you when I sue you for the difference in price. Okay, so let's take a look at the other side of that. And here we would have the buyer's remedy for a seller's breach. Okay, so if the seller breaches a contract for goods, what does that mean? They don't deliver the goods, or the goods aren't available. Okay, so let's see what the buyer gets. The buyer may do what we call covering. Cover is a term that we use here in the UCC to describe this idea of mitigation, really. The buyer may cover by purchasing replacement goods and receive the difference between the contract price and the cover price. So now, if I am buying iPods from you and you don't deliver them, now I may have to go buy them from someone else. I may have to attempt to cover my loss by buying them somewhere else. And if I have to pay more, then I can sue you for the difference between the contract price that I had with you and what I eventually had to pay. So if my contract with you is to buy them for $100 a piece and I ended up having to buy them for $125 a piece, I could sue you for the difference of $25 a piece. Or again, I might have the option here to recover the difference between the contract price and the market value, right? If there's any difference there. But I would, as the buyer choosing that option, I would have to establish what that value was. So when we got into court, I would have to offer some evidence, usually as to either the wholesale or retail average value to establish the market value. And there's a big and here with buyers. Okay, there's a difference with buyers and sellers. Buyers are entitled to consequential damages, right? Assuming again that they're foreseeable. So another example here. Let's say that it's the Christmas season, and I'm a retail seller of Christmas trees, and you're the grower of the Christmas trees, right? You have a tree farm, and I come to you, and I contract to buy a whole truckload of trees at $25 per tree. And I tell you at that time, I say, I'm going to have these trees by December 1st because I have a buyer already lined up on the other end that's going to pay me $30 per tree. So if you don't perform, I can't turn around and sell these at a retail price. And you know this going in, and you agree, and of course you don't perform by delivering them on December 1st. If I sue you, I might be able to recover consequential damages, those lost profits, because they were foreseeable to you, and you agreed to take on that risk at the time you contracted. Also, incidental damages. If I have any incidental damages, if I have to hire any agents as a result of your breach to get performance from another source to cover my damages, or if I have to advertise or anything like that, those are expenses related to your default or your breach, and so I would be able to recover those from you too. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about another interest that might come up, that the courts might want to remedy, and that's reliance interest or reliance damages. This is a remedy that a court would give to put the injured or non-breaching party in the position that he or she would have been in had there been no contract at all. So it's paying back what the non-breaching party lost out on as a result of the breach. And again, no speculative damages here. Courts will require some more definite proof of these damages. So this is maybe a situation where I spent money in reliance of your performance, waiting for it to happen. So let's say you were going to sell me an RV, like a recreational vehicle, like a really tall, a camper type vehicle. And in reliance of our contract, now you've signed the contract, and you're going to deliver it on Saturday. And in the meantime, my garage is not big enough to hold an RV, so I make some repairs. I have to hire someone to come in and make the ceiling on my garage taller in order to prepare for this RV. And then you breach the contract. Well, I actually spent money in reliance of your performance, which you didn't give. So a court might award me the cost of making the ceiling higher in reliance of your performance. Another place we see this sometimes is with real estate. And so I'll give you another example here real quick. Let's say that I'm going to buy some real estate from you, and I'm going to build a substantial building on it. And so I go out and I have some geological surveys, with your permission, done on the land prior to our closing. Now, we've signed the contract, you've agreed to sell me the land, and now in the meantime I'm going out and I am hiring a geological survey to make sure that the land is solid enough for me to build on it. And there's some costs associated with that. And then we get to the closing and you breach the contract. You don't give me the land. Well, as part of my lawsuit for breach, I might ask for reliance damages. Right? In other words, I might ask to be reimbursed for the cost of the geological survey that I did in reliance of your performance. And so that's another type of reliance interest that the court might remedy. Also notice on that last slide, just very briefly, the idea of promissory estoppel. Just don't forget that it is out there. And remember that it is an extra contract remedy. And so if you rely on a promise to your detriment, the court will allow you to sue and give you a remedy to the amount of your detriment. Right? But it's limited to what the amount of your reliance or detriment was. So just don't forget that that's out there. Okay, and lastly, we're going to talk about a restitution interest. Restitution interest, this is designed to return to the injured or non-breaching party a benefit that he or she has already conferred on the other side, which would be unjust to leave with that side. It often goes along with the remedy of rescission. If you remember the remedy of rescission we talked about, this is where a court will order a contract to be undone. Right? So I put the picture of the cow up there. Maybe it'll remind you of the bear and cow case that we talked about, where there was a mutual mistake of fact. Remember in that case or example that I gave you, the court ordered rescission, and they ordered the buyer farmer to give the cow back and the seller farmer to give the money back. Well, the actual act of paying each other back under a rescinded contract is called restitution. So making restitution is paying back what you got under a rescinded contract. You can see there it also goes along with what we call quasi-contract, if you remember that from one of our first chapters, to remedy unjust enrichment. So even in the case where there's not a contract in place, if one party receives unjust enrichment by the other side, then paying that back, a court might order restitution, right? The paying back of that undeserved benefit.